Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Humanities Forum. The Humanities Forum is a joint venture of the Humanities Program directed by Dr. Jim Keating from the Theology Department and the Development of Western Civilization Program directed by Dr. Alex Moffett. Dr. Raymond Hain serves as the moderator of the Humanities Forum. My name is Pat McFarland. I teach in the Humanities Program and the Development of Western Civilization Program here at Providence College. Today, the forum is glad to welcome our guest, Professor Timothy Burns. Professor Burns is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Graduate Program in Political Science at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. The title of Professor Burns' talk is Shakespeare's Political Wisdom. In a recent article in the New Criterion, Stephen Hayward wrote approvingly of the trend within certain departments of political science around the country of turning to the careful study of the poetry and drama of William Shakespeare in order to recover, as in Professor Burns' title, wisdom concerning political things. That is, the wisdom that comes from considering again the central questions of political thought. What is the best life for human beings? And what public arrangements are most conducive to that life? And most importantly, who should rule? Perhaps more than any other writer, these questions, along with a whole galaxy of possible answers and implications, are vividly dramatized by the towering, capacious, and human genius of Shakespeare. In Professor Burns' own words, Shakespeare's England, the England of Elizabeth I, existed between the theocratic Middle Ages and a modernity that aimed at full secularization. A time of both prodigious production in the arts and robust political life, it beckons thoughtful inhabitants of late modernity. To assist us in beckoning to Shakespeare's poetry and in perhaps transforming political science into political wisdom, we have no better guide than Professor Timothy W. Burns. Professor Burns is an acknowledged expert in the history of political philosophy, classical and modern political thought, and Shakespeare's political thought. He is the author or editor of several books, including his own Shakespeare's Political Wisdom, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2013, and with Thomas Pangle, Key Texts of Political Philosophy, an introduction published by Cambridge University Press in 2014, along with dozens of articles, book chapters, and book reviews. Please join me in welcoming to Providence College Professor Timothy Burns.
Thank you, Pat, and let me extend my thanks also to Professor Raymond Hain of the Philosophy Department and the Providence College Humanities Forum for inviting me to speak about Shakespeare. I'm deeply honored by the invitation, and I'm grateful for the wonderful hospitality that I've been shown today and yesterday evening. I'm also moved both to thank the humanities faculty here at Providence College for keeping alive the serious study of Shakespeare, and to congratulate all of you students for your extraordinary good fortune in being at a university that considers the serious study of Shakespeare to be a vital part of your liberal education. I've been asked to speak on Shakespeare's political wisdom, the subject of my book on Shakespeare, and I'm delighted to do so. I know that you're now, or some of you are reading the history plays, and this week in particular, the tragedy of Richard II. But I also know that most of you have read in the materials that were sent around on Monday my thoughts on Richard II and the history plays, and we spent some time at lunch talking about Richard II. So I'm going to omit that from my address here this afternoon, but I hope that your sharing of your many helpful insights on that play, which began at lunch this afternoon, could continue in the question and answer period, should you wish it to. I'm also going to speak then about what broadly Shakespearean political wisdom might mean, and about some contemporary obstacles to accessing it. And after looking at some of those, I'm going to offer a look at the tragedy of Othello as an example of how Shakespeare heightens the political in his plays. And then I'll conclude. So, why open ourselves first to Shakespeare's political wisdom? There are many helpful literary and historical studies of Shakespeare's plays with a wide variety of approaches. The subject matter of the plays that I write on is political. That is, the plays portray not only social activity, although they certainly do that, but also public, political activity. So they go beyond the merely private or interior life, especially of love affairs, that are so favored by modern novelists. I examine those plays' relentless attention to the questions that were once, and may someday again, become, or at least be recognized as, the heart and soul of politics. What kind of questions do I have in mind? Questions like the following: who should rule? What is justice? What is nobility? What are the virtues that make one worthy of ruling? What are the vices that make one unworthy of ruling or of sharing in rule? What virtues belong to a citizen? What virtues belong to a subject? And what are the corresponding vices? What's the relation of these virtues and vices to human happiness? These virtues have the support of reason? Do they stem from a coherent understanding of human life? Does justice, or any of the virtues, have divine or cosmic support? That Shakespeare's plays should address these questions in a manner that rewards careful study shouldn't be surprising. In the first place, we are, as Friedrich Nietzsche puts it, the beast with red cheeks, meaning we feel shame or guilt when we fail to live in accord with our opinions of what's just or noble or high. That is, in accord with our moral understanding, our moral opinions concerning worth or desert. We likewise experience the passions of anger, envy, jealousy, slight, revenge, embarrassment. And we're apt to feel pride in virtuous accomplishments and admiration and awe at the graceful and self-sacrificial deeds of others with whom we share in common enterprises. All of these experiences are informed by a uniquely human sense of worth or desert. And that sense is at the heart of political life. Relatedly, and secondly, political life was once the forum in which human beings argued and acted on these moral opinions and passions, bestowing honor and dishonor, praise and blame, recognition and opprobrium. Prior to the emergence of modern political philosophy and the regimes to which it gave rise, political life was, much more so than in our day, a stage on which virtues and vices were made manifest, or where, as Aristotle puts it, office will show the man. Specifically, human capacities that can develop only in bright moral light of public opinion could develop in political life and be exercised as the spiritual core of one's being. And Shakespeare made human beings who lived that fuller, richer political life the subject of many of his plays. For this reason, his plays were able to shape the taste and the prudence of generations of statesmen and citizens. Political men and women found in them vivid examples of political greatness, sound and flawed. If Shakespeare's plays are no longer a major part of the education of men and women, we're arguably the worse for it. We're even likely to sense as we read the plays that political life in our time, even at its best, lacks the richness and the elevation of reflection that we meet on every page of Shakespeare. So we who live in an age that we sense to be politically impoverished may thus stand to become aware that we stand in greater need of Shakespeare's plays than did citizens of past generations. They provide us with something that we're not likely to witness in our daily lives: moving and comprehensive pictures of the fate of tyrants, comprehensive portrayals of the character of good rulers and good regimes, of the relations of friends, and of the duties of citizens and subjects. The situations, the customs, the beliefs of the characters we confront in the plays are, of course, particular. Casca is a Roman and a pagan. Hamlet is a Dane and a Christian. But the wisdom that Shakespeare conveys through the characters' speeches and deeds is universal. His characters wrestle with some of the deepest moral and political problems that any serious human being is likely to confront. And as our minds are gradually opened by the plays, we come to realize that those problems remain with us, if in sometimes degraded contemporary forms. That is, that they're permanent problems. And as we become engaged with the plays, as we're moved by them, we're compelled to reflect on those problems. A full awareness of them, such as Shakespeare provides, can then begin to assist us in understanding our own political and moral lives. So by taking the opportunity that Shakespeare affords us to better understand ourselves and the political, moral life, is something, if we want to take advantage of it, is something that requires something unusual of us. It's necessary for us to refrain from imposing contemporary thought on the plays. It's necessary that we try to understand the characters as they understand themselves. And this restraint is not an easy thing. Like human beings everywhere, we're deeply shaped by the political order in which we live. And so we have to make great efforts if we want to be free of its particular limitations. As it happens, our political regime is, to a remarkable degree, formed by both modern and postmodern political philosophy and contemporary social science. Those two forces inhabit and form our political opinions and thoughts. Without realizing their modern provenance or questioning their adequacy to the phenomena that they're meant to describe, we readily use words such as the following: rights, power, ego, identity, cultures, lifestyle, values, self, realistic, idealistic, defense mechanism, empowering, and so on. Such words belong to the everyday life of contemporary liberal democracy. And while liberal democracy can be the source of good things, it can impede us when we approach the works of a thinker like Shakespeare. Instead of becoming a guide for us, as he could be, his plays become trapped and bound by our vocabulary and our jargon. Or they're confidently rejected by our thoughtless conviction that we live in an enlightened era, one ready to condemn quickly any apparent lapse into the thought of the past. So I suggest that we approach his plays naively. That is to say, without the sophistication that is lent to our thinking by contemporary social science, without the sophistication lent to our thinking by modern political philosophy and its vocabulary, as well as by some contemporary literary criticism shaped by postmodern political thought, that we approach Shakespeare ready to learn from him, not ready to learn about him. To state this somewhat differently, modern political philosophic doctrines have put a divide between us and these plays, and we need to set aside or bracket those doctrines if we are to understand the plays. I have in mind, above all, the doctrine of individual rights or claims, justified claims that we have against one another. Shakespeare doesn't talk about individual pre-political natural rights, ever. I have in mind also human beings as seekers of something called power. Rarely does Shakespeare talk about power. And he usually means only political power. Or of government being instituted by means of a social contract or the consent of the governed in order to secure individual rights, of institutions that deliberately check and balance one another, or of technology that's fostered as a means of conquering an allegedly chaotic nature, so that the resulting material plenty can be consumed and human misery and labor lessened. Well, all of these doctrines may indeed have had some healthy, salutary effects on the lives of men and women in liberal democracies. The way of life that used to be called political is distinct from them. And Shakespeare can help us to recover that life and therewith a more natural understanding of things. Political life proper, as we see in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, is something very close to what Aristotle describes in his Politics. It's distinguished not by obedience to the commands of a king, for example, or of a tyrant. It's distinguished not by a sub-rational attachment to one's country or fatherland, to my country right or wrong. It's not distinguished by individualist conceptions or concerns to protect and advance one's rights. It's distinguished rather by common deliberation about what's good and bad, what's just and unjust, what's noble and base. It's distinguished by the exercise of moral judgment about morally serious matters, and by the common, confirming, honoring of what is considered worthy of our admiration and our devotion, and the dishonoring and punishment of what's considered base or contemptuous or unjust. You probably use those words or something like them, maybe dirtier versions of them, in your private lives when you're talking with your friends. You might be a little leery of using them, for example, when you're in the classroom. You might then resort instead to a kind of flimsy moral relativism. Who am I to judge? Or everyone has their own perspective. Shakespeare doesn't let you do that. Shakespeare forces you to actually make judgments as you read the play. And he shows you other people making judgments, for good or bad. Political life proper, then, entails those judgments. And in order for those judgments to be good judgments, it requires the careful cultivation of virtues by citizens, for citizens, not as a means to something else, but rather as an end in itself. It involves prudence, deliberation, it involves rhetoric for the common good. It involves the cultivation of the virtues of the soul. And its central question is, who should rule? Who deserves to rule? You see that question emerging, for example, in the opening scene of The Tempest. You have some characters who are sailors. They know exactly what they should do in this situation. And you have a king on the ship who's trying to give orders and is told to get below because he mars their labors. Why shouldn't the king rule in that situation? By what right, by what justice is it the case that the sailors should rule? Okay, that's just a very simple example of it in a famous metaphor, ship of state. Who deserves to rule? What virtues qualify a human being to exercise leadership over others? What vices would disqualify one from leadership, and maybe from life itself, as indeed Macduff tells Malcolm? King becoming graces, you don't have them. You don't deserve to rule. You don't deserve to live, he tells him when he hears them. When he hears of his vices. So what do those virtues look like in action? Who can best guide us in common to our ends as citizens? And so who are we morally obliged to obey? Okay, I want to go a little bit further in this. I know that some of you have studied political philosophy, so some of you are likely to be familiar with the ways in which modern political philosophy has moved our political life, and with it has moved the lenses that we train on Shakespeare's plays, away from the questions that I was just talking about. But others might find a brief sketch of the most salient features of this development helpful. The question, who should rule, the central question of political life and of political philosophy, that question disappears from political life, and with it, the larger question of worth or desert or distributive justice. It disappears with the emergence of the modern doctrine of pre-political individual natural rights. The kind of rights that are spoken of, for example, in America's Declaration of Independence. Thomas Hobbes, the author of that doctrine, 1651. Nobody talked about pre-political natural rights prior to 1651. It's an astonishing fact. Hobbes lets us know that the disappearance of the question of worth or of who should rule is the intended effect of the doctrine of natural rights by declaring, as he does, that the question, who is the better man, has no place in the condition of mere nature, he says. All human beings by nature, Hobbes argues, are in every politically significant respect equal. We've taken this over from Hobbes. Or, he adds, significantly enough, if nature has made men unequal, such equality must be acknowledged. As we have to lie about it. We have to pretend that we're equal. And the reason for this pretense of equality, he makes clear, is to end the warfare to which all titles of rule frequently lead. In our perpetual and restless desire, he says, for power after power. Peaceful prosperity for all individuals, that's the goal of the modern regime, founded on individual rights. To attain it, titles to rule, even titles to nobility, are to be understood as vainglorious, not articulations of any true worthiness, but instead expressions of mere vanity, expressions of that unique passion, or passion unique to human beings, but an irrational passion that Hobbes says allows us to take joy in what's eminent. We only take joy in what's eminent, but there's no ground for that eminence. To replace all those claims, to found a new way of life that doesn't permit them, Hobbes gives us his novel doctrine of natural rights. which limits the end or purpose of government and thereby brings into being something altogether new. Establishing civil society on this basis, the securing of inalienable rights that you can't ever give up, no matter how unworthy you think you may be, or others may think. Doing that means that we don't understand ourselves to be setting up rulers any longer. We instead set up what Hobbes calls a sovereign, who's going to represent us to ourselves. Somebody who's going to remind us all the time, you fear violent death. Don't forget it. So don't get out of line, or you'll suffer it. The sovereign reminds us of the need to avoid violent death and peacefully live rather than vaingloriously. The person we set up as the sovereign may have unlimited power, but is radically limited in aim or intention. What's the aim? What's the goal? Protecting rights, and thereby securing peace or ensuring comfortable self-preservation of citizens. So this new type of governor is not a ruler. He's a governor. That means he acts as does a governor on a car or a truck. Doesn't direct it toward an end, but merely keeps our individual, subjective, arbitrary, passionate pursuits in line. We're left free, Latin liber, hence a liberal regime. We're left free to do whatever we want to do so long as the law doesn't forbid it. The law does not tell us, as Aristotle claims law should and does. The law does not tell us to devote ourselves to any alleged common good. The law doesn't command us to a way of life. The law instead forbids us from going outside of certain bounds in the pursuit of whatever we want. The purpose of individual rights is to protect us from the demands of others. Hobbes intends what he calls the law of man. And he says this, do not do unto others as you would not have them do unto you, to replace the law of the Gospels, which he quotes, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Devotion to the good of others is part of the whole to which we belong. That's to give way to indifference to others. And it gives way to that in a new realm, one that comes into being when this doctrine of inalienable rights comes to predominate. That new realm is called society. There, you may, with equal dignity, pursue the occupation you wish, because there isn't any true or intrinsic worth to any activity or calling. Worth is determined, rather, by the selfishly driven forces of commercial markets. As Hobbes rightly puts it, in wartime, generals are at a premium. In peacetime, not so much. That's when you want judges. Worth or desert is determined then by what an aggregate of unfathomable others desire and happen to believe about you. The ordering principle then of the liberal regime is official indifference to the question of worth or desert, official indifference to titles to rule. Such regimes reject the pretense to know what's best for human beings and the need or authority to direct citizens in accordance with what's best. The unencumbered or the autonomous self, as he's come to be called, who creates his own meaning as it suits him. Now I'm quoting from Justice Kennedy in the Casey case. That is the latest, and it is by no means the unintended result of the modern doctrine of individual rights. That self and his overwhelming concerns is not found in Shakespeare's plays. So, to approach Shakespeare's plays naively means, above all, to approach them without taking for granted the truth of these modern doctrines, with which, in however modified a form, we've all grown up, and with a conscious effort to avoid imposing them and their corollaries on the plays. It requires an openness to the plays as they present themselves to us with all their bracing challenges to our presuppositions and assumptions about political life. But you might well ask, is that how Shakespeare would have us read his plays? I think Shakespeare's own presentation on the stage of characters and settings, remote and radically different from his own, shows us that it is indeed. As one might easily suspect from reading his plays, and as Colin Burrow has recently shown, Shakespeare knew a great deal of ancient classical literature quite well. And understanding the subtle and the surprising things that Shakespeare did with that knowledge is helpful for understanding his plays. To Shakespeare, ancient works were alive. They could reveal important or lost or overlooked truths to his contemporaries. It wasn't uncommon for young men of Shakespeare's generation to read Cicero, Ovid, Horace, Plautus, and for those in universities, Plutarch, Plato, and Aristotle, in order to learn how to live in the present. For them, engagement with the literature of the past was driven by need and use, as Burrow says. And Shakespeare himself had actually encountered this very approach to literature in the writings of Plutarch, whose comparisons of the Greeks and the Romans, as Burrow puts it, added a trans-temporal ethical perspective, which assumes that human actions can be judged according to the same criteria, irrespective of time and place, to the ethnographical perspective of individual lives. Shakespeare could, as Burroughs puts it, think both historically and unhistorically at once. He was open to the possibility that what was to be learned from a Plutarch or from any accounts of the speeches and deeds of citizens of an ancient city might well be most important to people in his day, might well be unavailable to, might well be superior to the wisdom of his own day. So, what I'm asking you to do is to read Shakespeare as Shakespeare read Plutarch. Shakespeare was able to do this with Plutarch and other authors because he not only learned from his ancient sources how to write, he did do that, but also the meaning of virtue, and equally important, to raise questions about virtue. But now, how can this be? Wasn't Shakespeare manifestly bound by the opinions of his own time and place? Wasn't he bound by the opinions of Elizabethan England? Wasn't he bound to distort the life of ancient Rome or Greece or Venice or Verona? Here, too, Burrow is quite helpful. He thrice alludes to the art of careful writing that's needed and practiced, was needed under Roman emperors. You couldn't simply say what you might want to say under those emperors. Ovid wrote, for example, with some care late in the reign of the Emperor Augustus. Tacitus and Seneca were wily critics of late imperial decadence, and Plutarch believed the Greeks superior in culture and education to the Romans, but, quote, was not about to risk an overt assertion of superiority to his rulers. Shakespeare was attentive to that kind of writing. He was an admirer of it. He was an admirer of the prudential art of writing and speaking. And we can even see such cautious politic speech in his plays. For example, in Macbeth, not only does Malcolm initially lie about his character in order to test Macduff in the passage I alluded to earlier, but also The doctor who's treating Lady Macbeth says, "I think, but dare not speak." Casca in Julius Caesar feigns rusticity. Shakespeare makes him sound like a redneck because he's pretending to be one. And he does that, Casca does, the better to avoid scrutiny by Caesar. Brutus doesn't see that. Cassius does. And King Lear, in King Lear, Edgar becomes poor Tom to hide from Edmund and his forces. Aware of the need to flatter rather than openly trouble the mores, the moral and political convictions of his contemporaries, Shakespeare himself wrote between the lines. Perhaps most importantly, in many places, we see Shakespeare's keen attention to the ways in which we deceive not only ourselves but also others. And Shakespeare's careful readers will be led by his plays to avoid it. So if Shakespeare appears to be a mere product of his time, that's a mere appearance. Shakespeare is bound to be appearing one way and actually saying something different. But we have to be cautious about our use of what we think we know of classical literature and politics in interpreting Shakespeare's plays. Burroughs tells us that the Stoicism defined ancient Rome. Stoicism counsels suicide against bad fortune. He interprets the plays accordingly, but and the only place in Shakespeare's plays where the matter of Stoicism and suicide is actually discussed, that's in the fifth act, of Julius Caesar. Brutus tells Cassius, "As a Stoic, I blame suicide." And then he's pressed by Cassius. He says, "Okay, so you're going to be marched through the streets of Rome in a parade?" And Brutus says, "Oh, wait a minute. I bear too great a mind to be paraded in defeat through the streets of Rome." And so he's ready to kill himself. And says he abandons his stoicism. Similarly, when we hear King Lear on the heath, he's angry, he's frustrated, he's on the verge of a breakdown, owing to the absence of the divine support he has always assumed justice to have. He proclaims, "I am a man more sinned against than sinning." One critic says, here he's following the lines from Seneca's Hippolytus, whose hero calls upon the gods as follows: "Strike me with lightning. I am guilty. I deserve to die." Does anybody see a problem with that? King Lear says, "I am more sinned against than sinning. I'm not guilty." This critic says, well, he's thinking of the lines of Seneca. "I'm guilty." How do you explain the difference? This critic says, well, Lear wants to say those lines of Seneca, but he forgets them. It's a mighty act of amnesia. Let me venture that had Shakespeare wished to show Lear forgetting lines of Seneca, he could easily have done so. So we need to refrain from imposing what we might wish Shakespeare to be saying in light of our own understanding of ancient classical, political, and philosophic literature. Still, the greater obstacle comes, it seems to me, from imposing modern political philosophic learning on Shakespeare's text in order to turn it into what we want. And here the recent work of Alex Shulman is an avowed modern, can serve as a cautionary tale. Shulman approaches Shakespeare to advance a vision of political modernity that he happens to favor. And his findings tend to bury the meaning of Shakespearean speeches and separate the text from its readers. Let me just give two examples. Shulman reminds us that Thomas Hobbes presents the state of nature as a war of all against all. He notes that the scene of Lear on the heath is nightmarish. He concludes it represents Hobbes's model. the state of nature. But we've read King Lear, so we know that faithful friends like Kent and Gloucester come to Lear's aid on the heath. The scene is in no way Hobbesian. So too, the Arden Forest, inhabited by articulate lovers, represents for Schulman the alternative comic Rousseauian model of the state of nature. But if we've read Rousseau, we know that humans in the state of nature, according to Rousseau, lacked reason. They lack speech, they lack love, they lack all passions that come in their train. So, could do the same also with some postmodern critics of Shakespeare, like Alexander Pye. Now, by none of this do I mean to suggest that Shakespeare is foolishly unaware of the self-interest or the kind of debunking of moral virtue on which early modern and many postmoderns have sought to establish theories of political life. I rather want to argue that Shakespeare allows us to see that these debunking theories involve a considerable narrowing of political life. And we know this because we know that Shakespeare was indeed aware of a literature that, most often in comedy, traced human motives to self-interest in a send-up of virtue and devotional love. You might be familiar with Boccaccio's comic tales in the Decameron. There's a film version of it, many of the stories done by Federico Fellini that I would recommend. One of Boccaccio's friends was Giambattista Giraldi Cinthio. And his work, called The Moorish Captain, was actually Shakespeare's source for the tragedy of Othello. By comparing and contrasting Shakespeare's Othello with that source, we can see Shakespeare in his workshop, as it were, and we can see very clearly what emerges as Shakespeare's implicit critique of the kind of debunking of virtue and devotion that's the heart of Cinthio's work. We can see, moreover, that this critique is achieved by an artful heightening by Shakespeare of the political in his play, Othello, and the relation of this heightening to a deepening and elevation of erotic devotional love. So I'm going to devote the balance of my time to a comparison and contrast of these two works. I hope it reveals, just to anticipate my conclusion, Shakespeare's attention to the matter of worth or desert that is central to political or public life, in its tension with the sub-political but moral demands of personal love and marriage. In keeping with this, Shakespeare's portrayal of the concern with and Iago's manipulation of a chief focus of public life, reputation, is unparalleled in any of his other plays. Second, Shakespeare makes this presentation while deepening the central character's conjugal love and its relation to a sense of justice or worth. He thereby suggests the same motivational love and its attendant desire to be held worthy in the eyes of the beloved informs both public and private life, though it takes on a new dimension in public life. Third, Shakespeare raises the question of the relation of these two things, public and private esteem, to happiness. He announces this as a theme with the name of Desdemona, which is from the Greek word for unhappiness. And said Shakespeare does not make Othello handsome, as did Cinthio. His Othello needs to woo a woman whose heart can be captured by attention to his moral or spiritual deserts, rather than by his looks or by what his father calls, Iago calls sense, and whose devotion, Desdemona's devotion to Othello, is correspondingly total. Finally, Shakespeare's virtuous Othello can be tempted out of his confidence in his wife's devotion to him only by a perfectly devilish man, one who claims on very dubious grounds to see through the appearance of virtue and devotion that dominates public speech, and who manipulates public appearances in order to bring doubt and then a sense of grievous injustice into Othello's soul. Okay, let's start with Othello. We'll go through three of the characters. Start with Othello. He's a character who must, precisely owing to the circumstances of his being a Moor, rely on strict justice rather than on Venetians favoring of him for his looks or promoting him out of love of their own. He's not one of theirs. The play is for this reason made deeply political. It explicitly transcends in the first act both race and family. The concern with family is brutally crushed in the Venetian Republic's Senate in the figure of Brabantio, Desdemona's father. He's there for his own daughter, and so his concern has to be set aside. He's not there for the public good. In Shakespeare's play, it's only two unattractive characters, Brabantio and Iago, who present the thesis, which is central to Cinthio's story, that Desdemona's marriage to the Moor as a Moor is mistaken. So two unattractive characters say that in Othello. None of the attractive characters do. And the Duke, upon hearing Brabantio's desperate claim that there must be bewitchment that's behind the marriage of my daughter, it's so contrary to sense, I can't get over it. The Duke grasps immediately that Brabantio's public case is bootless. He has to resort to enchantment? Come on. Cinthio's Moor is said by Desdemona, so we've got Cinthio over here. His Moor, the Othello character, is said by Desdemona to be angry. Why? Because he's a Moor. Moors are always angry. What angers Shakespeare's Othello, on the other hand, is strictly the perception of his displacement in the heart of his beloved Desdemona by Cassio. That is, the alleged secret infidelity of the one who had found him worthy of love and devotion. Othello strikes Desdemona angrily for the first time and publicly after reading a letter from Venice announcing Othello's recall and Cassio's replacement of him as governor of Cyprus, and upon hearing Desdemona's accompanying statement of her love of Cassio, which Othello, misled by Iago, mistakes to mean more than friendship. The visiting Venetian official, Lodovico, is astonished by this. He's astonished by the change that this behavior manifests in Othello. Is this, he says, he asks, is this the noble Moor whom our full Senate called all in all sufficient? Is this the nature whom passion could not shake, whose solid virtue the shot of accident nor dart of chance could neither graze nor pierce? Far from being one of the ever-angry Moors of whom Cinthio's Desdemona speaks, Othello was never angry before, even according to Iago on the field of battle. In fact, the first lines we hear from him are quite clement. It's better, he tells Iago, with Rodrigo unharmed. And shortly thereafter, facing the unfriendly arrival of Brabantio and officers, this gentle soldier even breaks up a potential sword fight, quoting Christian scripture. But he also knows how to threaten malefactors when it's necessary for the common good. These deeds and speeches display what we may call Othello's virtues, both classical and Christian, as well as the trust and share in rule given to him on their account. These scenes likewise allow us to see the comparison that Shakespeare draws between Othello's triumph on the field of battle and his triumph in love. Just as he inherits no authority in Venice, but has to, and does, merit his offices there, so too he's got to earn Desdemona's affection. Shakespeare appears to reverse in this way what he had found in Cinthio's tale. He gives Othello a great soul and an unattractive body, instead of a handsome body and a low soul. And Othello would indeed be great-souled, but his sense of worth proves to be more fragile than that of any great-souled man. A desire for costly retributive justice, fed and nourished by the misleading impressions presented by Iago, that's what leads Othello to kill Desdemona. Cinthio's Moor comes to deeply regret the death of Desdemona, of his Desdemona. He comes thereby to despise the Iago character, the ensign, for having led him to kill her. And his attempt to destroy the Moor and the captain takes up a quarter of the story in Cinthio's tale. Not so in Shakespeare's Othello. Othello's attempt on Iago's life comes only toward the end, at the very end of the final act. In Cinthio's tale, the Moor is held back from killing the Iago character by his fear only of inviolable human justice. You know what that means. He thinks he's going to be caught. Otherwise, he'd do it. Having no remorse at having committed an injustice, but simply afraid of getting caught. And on the basis of this fear, refusing to confess his actual crimes or sins, even when he's tortured, or to give in to any remorse. That's how Cinthio's Moor displays what Cinthio calls courage. That's the virtue of courage. That is, Cinthio presents courage as entailing a clear-sighted attention to one's own long-term good, over and against what any immediate pain or remorsefulness for your wrongdoing might dictate. But we have to wonder how genuinely clear-sighted it is, since it goes together again strikingly with Cinthio's suggestion that the Moor comes to realize that he would have preferred to live happily in ignorance of Desdemona's infidelity to living unhappily with knowledge of her infidelity. He had failed in his anger to consider that killing his beloved might cause him unhappiness. But with Desdemona gone, Cinthio's discontented Moor comes to hate the ensign as the cause of his having lost all joy in life. So, a desire to know the truth, this is what Cinthio is teaching, is misguided if it destroys the happiness that's available in ignorance. Only a moralizing fool wishes to know the truth about a spouse's infidelities, rather than to live in blissful ignorance of them. Shakespeare's Othello, by striking contrast, demands to learn the truth about Desdemona and Cassio, and he demands it for justice's sake. He's willing to suffer so as not to live deceived about the worth confirmed by Desdemona's love. Similarly, he's willing to suffer her loss, owing to the sense of having to rectify an injustice done by her. And when pity for Desdemona, at being trifled with by Cassio, rekindles his love for Desdemona, how does Iago draw Othello back to the firm resolve to kill her? Does so by appealing to Othello's sense of justice. If you're so fond of her iniquity, give her patent to offend, he says. For if it touch you not, it come near nobody. Iago similarly is successful in suggesting how meet it would be for the unfaithful Desdemona to be strangled in her bed. So, a desire for costly, retributive justice, fed and nourished by misleading impressions provided by Iago. That's what leads Othello to kill Desdemona. Let me turn now to Iago. The first thing one notices about Shakespeare's Iago when he's set against the Iago character of Cinthio, the ensign, is that he's given a name, Iago, which is Italian for James or Jacob, Yaakov, catch by the heel or crooked, like Jacob grabbing at Esau's heel. Even in this crooked man, though, appears a certain elevation of the political. Initially griping to another character, Rodrigo, his buddy, griping to him that he's been passed over unjustly for the rank of lieutenant by Othello. Othello should have promoted him to the rank of lieutenant, not Cassio. Iago appeals with this argument to what he calls old gradation. That is to say, seniority or time in rank, over and against the Republican principle of letters and affection. That is to say, letters of recommendation, merit. So he has a political principle. It's seniority. It shouldn't be the Republican principle of merit. But that initial explanation of Iago's hatred of Othello, he overlooked me, that doesn't convince Rodrigo. Rodrigo says to him, if you hate Othello so much, why do you remain in his service? What do you stick around for? And Iago's reply to this entails an extended and striking, if ultimately deficient, reflection on political life, one that has led to a cynicism in Iago, far more deliberate than that of Cinthio's ensign. He starts with the statement of an important political truth. We cannot all be masters. Republican life, you could say, wishes this very thing. It wishes that all be masters. It wishes that honors of offices be distributed equally, ruling and being ruled in turn. Iago sees clearly that even in such a political order, there will always be rulers and ruled. And he then states a dangerous result of this fact for the rulers. Nor all masters, he says, cannot be truly followed. Disgruntled followers pose a problem for the ruler, the master, or anyone who would rule over others by dint of superior virtue. Venice's lower-ranked citizens are not all going to be content to be ruled over, even if they pretend to be content. Okay, two truths. From these two truths, Iago draws out a very dubious lesson for Rodrigo. There are, he says, duteous and knee-crooking knaves. They bend their knees down. They are used by their masters, and they are cashiered by their masters. Now, Iago blames that outcome, that unjust outcome, not on the masters. He blames it on the dutiful servants. He despises them. He admires those with a clever attention to more than their merely daily provender, those, he says, who keep yet their hearts attending on themselves. This type bears ever in mind that duties performed for a master are actually motivated by self-interest, while duteous servants forget that all the time. They think they deserve something. This admirable, self-consciously selfish type, Iago's own type, have, he says, some soul. They do themselves homage. They successfully pretend to be dutiful servants, but all the while they line their coats with cash. So he concludes, heaven is my judge. I am not what I am. So Shakespeare thus accords even Iago, the most private-spirited man in the play, a political argument to justify to Rodrigo his deeply cynical private-spiritedness. And that justification, as the play makes manifest, extends in Iago's case to the vilest of deceptive pretenses of devotion to justice or honesty. Iago himself most assuredly seeks no grand or sublime fulfillment. The hope for such a thing is, he suggests, what leads a faithful servant away from his true good. But Iago's argument can't be said to achieve a genuine or convincing justification of selfishness over and against duteous service. Much less can it be said to justify the deeds in which Iago subsequently engages, because the argument assumes what it sets out to prove. It assumes that all human action is necessarily self-serving. Iago's pretense is a distinctively Christian pretense, unlike the pretense of Cinthio's Venice, which is pagan. And that pretense helps us to understand what Shakespeare has given us in him. It prepares us to notice this about Iago. Instead of concluding his lecture, as I said a moment ago, to Rodrigo, with what he appears to be leading up to, namely, I'm not what I seem to be, Iago uses a much more curious expression. He says, I am not what I am. He thereby calls himself the very opposite of what the biblical God calls himself with the Tetragrammaton. I am what I am. Iago not only hopes to be deceptive, but would have heaven witness that he himself is the very opposite of God. He would be the prince of darkness by appearing to be all honesty, even or precisely when alone, as we learn in Soliloquy. He claims of his plan to drive Othello to jealous hatred, that, quote, hell and night must bring this monstrous birth to the world's light. And likewise in Soliloquy, he claims to follow divinity of hell. Shakespeare even manages to present in Iago a man guilty of all 7 of the deadly sins. So what Othello falls by, great-souled Othello, is very much the tempting of a self-consciously devilish Christian. Rome, we might say, falls to a Christian devil of a man, when an otherwise great-souled man is unsure of his worth in the eyes of a saintly Christian woman. But the creation of this devilishly cynical man offers up a critique of dutiful service in favor of mere appearance. That critique required, and it received, another significant and very striking remaking of Cinthio's Iago character. Cinthio's ensign, his Iago, loves Desdemona. He plots to kill her when this love goes unrequited. Well, what about Shakespeare's Iago? Shakespeare splits the ensign of Cinthio's tale into 2 characters. We've already seen them in dialogue, Iago and Rodrigo. Rodrigo loves Desdemona. Shakespeare's Iago is not in love. When Iago speaks of his possible love of Desdemona, it's strictly as a desire to have sex with her in revenge for his suspected cuckolding by Othello. Shakespeare even removes from his play the 3-year-old child that Cinthio had given to his Iago character and his wife. Shakespeare's Iago is childless, and he's inclined to see the conceiving and raising of children as nothing more than a universal feminine plot. Adding Rodrigo to his play allows Shakespeare to give us a Iago who schools Rodrigo in explicit arguments against erotic devotional love. That's crucial. Because if Iago's own underhanded and petty life is to make sense, if it's to be consistent with his claim about hidden but ever-operative self-interest in public life, then of course devotional love, too, and above all, has to be reduced to self-interest. That disquisition on love comes about as this despondent Rodrigo claims to see no reason to live anymore. For his own selfish reason, Iago tries to buck him up. He does so by appealing to self-interest. Having self-love, he says, that's what it means to be human. Erotic love is nothing more than a temporary beguilement. It's an offshoot of selfish carnal desire. Love can't really ascend above lust. It cannot be self-sacrificial. Rodrigo initially rejects this argument. He says, Desdemona, whom I love, has virtue, she will be devoutly faithful, that is, to her loving husband. So I have no chance with her. Iago says, virtue, a fig. Love, that is merely lust with the permission of the will. A real man doesn't give that permission. A real man acts rationally. It's calculating self-interest that rules a real man's soul. So if, as has been recently argued by a scholar of Shakespeare, University of Virginia, Paul Cantor, if Shakespeare and Cervantes brought about the modern secularized world by dint of a Machiavellian realism, if they furthered progress in civilization over and against allegedly crazed devotional love experienced in pre-modern times, and that is Cantor's thesis, Shakespeare cured us of love, then we'd have to conclude that Iago is Shakespeare's mouthpiece. There's ample reason to doubt this. Let me conclude by talking about that reason. Iago discounts devotional love, and that goes together with the fact that for him, as for Machiavelli, appearance is everything. Reputation, appearance is everything. He's ever attentive to appearance. He cloaks his villainy with it. And seeming is being to one for whom reputation for devotional virtue, not the virtue itself, is vitally important. And it can be so if virtue isn't an end in itself. If it's not desirable to possess for its own sake, but is merely a means to good things. And if, therefore, the dutiful servant and lover is indeed somebody to be despised as a sap. If virtue is just a means, then virtue in truth merely is mere seeming, as Machiavelli teaches, since far from devotional fidelity that virtue demands, and for which we admire virtue. We admire the Marines because they live by semper fi. They're ever faithful. It can and should, if it's not an end in itself, it can and should be abandoned when some better means is available for the desired end. One who's monstrously good at manipulating appearances would then be the one who's truly virtuous. Reputation, public opinion would be his element. So it is with Iago. When Cassio delivers his famous lines about his stolen reputation, Iago, feigning to comfort Cassio, says, pay attention to sense, not reputation. Reputation is unmerited often. It can be easily won back. That is, Iago, honest Iago, knows the ways of reputation. It's the rumor that matters to him, the bending of appearances in order to win his way as the monstrously great deceiver. But Shakespeare shows us the deep flaws of the cynical admirer of his own machinations. Iago admits to himself that the happiness of Michael Cassio, a man as he thinks and has some reason to think, is as untroubled by a conscience as Iago is, mars Iago's happiness. It's equally true, though, that this eschewer of devotional love also hates Othello, and he hates Desdemona. Why? They are living refutations of his own life. He hates them because they represent the possibility of serious love, love of one's mind or soul for another, as indeed he hears Othello and Desdemona present it. Like all cynics, Iago would have high-toned devotional love such as theirs be something not only foolish, but impossible. Some signs of his error in this regard are Iago's failure to anticipate Othello's pity for Desdemona, provoked by Cassio's trifling with her, and a few other things. So what motivates this man who is mistakenly cynical about loving devotion, private and public? The cynicism seems to hide a deep disappointment with fidelity. Iago's married to a woman who, by her own admission to Desdemona, would indeed, for the right price, commit adultery. When that wife in the final scene speaks of Desdemona's devoted fidelity to Othello and of Iago's role in the use of an important symbolic handkerchief, the defeated Iago berates and counter-accuses his wife. "Filth! Thou liest!" His rage seems to bespeak his disappointment that Emilia has not remained faithfully obedient to him and his wicked orders. But his words also are an attempt to keep the truth of what has happened, not only from the others, but from himself. The reality he wishes is one in which there's no possibility of genuine fidelity and devotional love, because its existence makes his own life appear not best, but pathetic. So his wife's declaration of the existence of such love doesn't amuse, it enrages him. But his wife, Emilia, horrified at what her husband has wrought, exposes Iago's deception and names him as the horrific culprit. She's killed by Iago after she's spoken the truth, and so with Iago having no possible motive to kill her except to avenge her for what he considers infidelity. So even this cynic has, as we have come to suspect, a deep sense of justice, a poorly educated sense of justice. Being found out, uncovered, made public, destroys him. And he lashes out to kill his disclosing wife. She, on the other hand, torn between two moral obligations, her obligation to her husband and her obligation to Desdemona, is pulled at last out of the justice of the private realm or household and brought into the public realm of justice. In full awareness that means maybe I'll never go home again. As a result of her death at Iago's hand, the play's two women die opposite deaths. The one hiding her husband's murder, the other dying for disclosing her husband's hidden crime. In Cinthio's tale, by contrast, the ensign's wife is alive at the end, despite her clear guilt as a party to the death of the murder of Desdemona. Through her fate, Cinthio would seem to wish to highlight the hypocrisy of justice, which appears as the only truth about justice you need to learn. Shakespeare elevating the lives of his characters and their loves and putting the cynical teaching of Cinthio into the mouth of this deeply repulsive Iago and showing what's mistaken about it offers a fuller explanation of a great-souled but flawed man, one who loved wisely but not too well. Loved not wisely but too well. So let me conclude. I began by speaking to you of your good fortune in being at a college that still teaches Shakespeare as part of a liberal education. Shakespeare is a firm rock on which you can build your education. Maybe, having read Othello, you'll read the work of Cinthio and of his friend Boccaccio. And maybe you'll even turn to Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, with its extended debate about the merits and drawbacks of comedy. And from there, maybe to Henri Bergson's essay on comedy. Upon reading the speeches and deeds and thoughts of Brutus and Cassius and Alcibiades, maybe you'll be moved to read Plutarch's Lives. And from there, maybe you'll be led to Cicero, and maybe then to his sources, Thucydides, Plato, Xenophon, and Aristotle, and from there even to the great Islamic and Jewish philosophers who commented on their writings, Farabi, Avicenna, Averroes, and Maimonides. Upon hearing Hamlet declare, "The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king," or "Thus conscience does make cowards of us all," maybe you'll, wondering about this thing called a conscience, be led to the thought of St. Augustine, the first to spell out the doctrine of the conscience, and from there to an exploration of the full, rich, and abundant tradition of Christian and biblical theology. I certainly hope so. But even if you read only Shakespeare, thoughtfully and naively, you'll already have a guide to life's permanent questions, a wise poet to move you to the life of reflection and thoughtful action, That's the mark of a liberally educated human being. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Burns. Let's take just a couple questions. We have a reception we can invite everyone to in the great room for further discussion and conversation. But we'll take a few questions. We'd like to have the students go first, maybe until about 4:30. Okay, Jianyi.
Please.
Thank you very much for being here and giving us this lecture. So may I just propose you one reflection and one question? So the reflection is, so it seems, so you talk about, so Shakespeare's political wisdom is rooted in, if you will, the sense of honor, the sense of worth, and also, if you will, the virtue, rather than so freedom and equality, which we embrace today. And my question would be, do you think there could be a developed boundary between so individual ethics and individual virtue and, if you will, public policy? Or in other words, so what is the boundary between so personal ethics and public policies? Or is there any boundary or distinction between the cultivation of individual virtue and the refinement of political system?
Okay, thanks. I'm going to try to answer those 2 or 3 questions in there, I think. First, I didn't mean to suggest that prior to modernity there is no political regime that honors freedom and equality. There was democracy. It wasn't a liberal democracy, though. And one has an example of a non-liberal democracy right now in Iran. What characterizes liberal democracy is the distinction that I drew between the private and the public. So most of our moral judgments get made in the private realm today. And those moral judgments inevitably bring up, even if we have an official equality for purposes of politics, they inevitably bring up inequalities. So you can think of some of the terms that you might use for admiration or some of the terms that you might use for blame. Very frequently today, those terms of blame are things that you can't say in polite society, but that you might say to your friends, presumably because they're impolite. And so it's not as if we don't continue to feel the very same sense of worth or desert, which informs our opinions and our passions. It's not necessarily in itself a virtue. You might feel a sense of worth that you're not entitled to, or I might. It's more likely I would. And that would mean that I might have a short wick. I might fly off a handle very quickly. I might be thin-skinned, as some people, for example, say that our president is. That would not be a virtue. It would be a vice. You could say that healthy political life honors, it confirms by honor a true sense of worth or desert. Now, for that to happen, I did suggest, as you pointed out, that there would have to be some kind of end. For that to happen today, there would have to be an end between this distinction between the private and the public, between society and the state, that virtually defines the modern liberal state, without which it goes away. I'm not suggesting that there be an end to such a thing. What I'm suggesting rather, and I don't think there can be, I wouldn't advocate it. If there is to be any kind of cultivation of virtue in a liberal democracy, it has to be done in the private realm. It has to be done in schools. It has to be done in churches and synagogues. It's not something that can be done publicly. The principles don't allow it. But aside from that, what I would like us to do with Shakespeare is to have an experience of pre-modern political life that is not readily available to us, so that a deficiency, a lacuna in our everyday experiences can be filled by reading Shakespeare. I hope that answers.
Thank you. Is another question? Anyone? You have a question? Oh, you don't? You looked at me like you wanted to ask a question. Yes.
So thank you very much for giving this talk today. I was not lucky enough to be a part of any of this conversation about Richard II that occurred beforehand, so I would just be curious to hear a little bit about how this applies to Richard II.
Okay. Sorry, this is going to bore some of the people who were there at lunch then. Richard II, and as the opening of, well, it's in the second tetralogy, but it's the opening of the full history plays. The tragedy of Richard II gives us a play that is striking for its antiquity, or rather its staleness. The life, the political life in Richard II is almost non-existent. So there's no question of who should rule. In the opening scene, there's supposed to be a trial. It doesn't take place. It's going to be replaced by a joust. That doesn't take place. There's very little room, it seems, for deliberation about what's good and bad, just and unjust, noble and base. How come? The rest of the play seems to suggest how come. In the mouths of many of the characters, including above all Richard's, he rules not by any determination of worth. He rules by dint of the grace of God. And God's ways are not our ways. He rules because he's God's anointed, and he expects legions of angels to come to his defense when Bolingbroke comes to England with his troops. So the very puzzling thing to me about this play is the absence of the political and why it's there. And I think that the reason that's offered is this strange doctrine of the divine right of kings, which removes the question of who should rule from political life. So in the subsequent history plays, the attempt to mend the fabric, the political and social fabric that has been rent by Bolingbroke, that is Henry IV's killing, murder of God's anointed, and thereby the destruction of the one principle of legitimacy, you could say, that medieval England had. The attempt to repair that is spelled out in great detail. So in the two Henry IV's, you get a number of attempts, a number of uprisings against the king, but much more interestingly, you get the story of Hal and his realization of what his father has done and how he intends to become king once his father's gone. And how is that? Well, what his father has done, really, without his father knowing it, is to destroy the power of ceremony, to destroy the power of mores, of customs, of those things that both bind a monarch to the common good and that are repetitious and that one might get tired of, that tend to grow stale, and substitutes for it spectacle. And here again, I think there's a real comparison to be drawn with our present president. That is, He's often praised as a showman, which I think he is. He's very good at that. And so is Hal. Hal is somebody who wants to hide his virtue. He wants to hang out with lowlives and ne'er-do-wells so that he can all the more brilliantly show off his virtue. And he speaks very eloquently against custom and against ceremony especially. So then how is he going to have any legitimacy if he's destroying all ceremony? He does it by means of these spectacles. He does it by means of things like the killing of Hotspur. Nobody expects that. He does it. He steals his honor. He does it by the invasion of France. He also subordinates, to some extent, he subordinates the clergy with the invasion of France. He threatens the bishops with taxation, and in order to avoid that, they give him a big chunk of change so that he can invade France. Remove thereby many of the threats against his own rule, as his father had warned. His father's plan was to go to the Holy Land. It was to have a crusade, but perhaps for political reasons, perhaps out of genuine remorse. Henry V decides, we'll attack France. And just one more thing, he doesn't seem to be aware of the way in which this attempt to give himself a legitimacy through spectacle, through war, foreign war, that those have a further deleterious effect on the common good. So there are an awful lot of criminals, there are a lot of robbers, there are a lot of Falstaffs and his buddies in England. However much you may think Falstaff is a really fun guy, you might enjoy his own debunking of virtue. I think finally Shakespeare says somebody who steals not only purses, steals honor, is not, to have that rampant in a regime is not healthy. And Hal doesn't seem to be fully aware of that. He doesn't seem to realize what it means to have a royal hanging out in an inn with people of easy virtue and lending his name to that. I was going to say something about the present royals, but I won't. So what happened subsequently, very briefly, Henry VI, being much more seriously pious than his father, loses France. And England becomes, once again, it becomes rife with vice. Richard III is the emblem of that, you could say. And legitimacy, political legitimacy, is not restored until Henry VIII, with his rule over the church and his destruction of the Catholic Church, his destruction of the monasteries, his taking over of the wealth of the church. You might have noticed that Richard III's body was found a couple of years ago. I don't know if any of you saw this. So it's quite amazing. You see the grave, and he really is hunchbacked. Where was it found? It was under a parking lot. How come? Well, there used to be a monastery there. Now it's a parking lot. That's Henry VIII's work. And again, I would say that's something that Shakespeare did not, he conveys to us that he doesn't think that that's a good thing. That the destruction of the possibility of this very highest life, I think is what I would say, the contemplative life, the life that Prospero led prior to losing his rule of Milan, that life, the destruction of it is something that Shakespeare doesn't think represents a progress. So that the history plays don't represent a progress, they represent a wrestling with all of these good and bad things coming out of it with this doctrine of divine right that they all have to wrestle with.
Okay, please join us in the great room for reception. Thank you, Professor Burns.